how did you know you wanted to be a scientist? Like, that's what you wanted to do?
Oh, I had no clue. Yeah. I wasn't going to go to college. I have a condition called dyslexia, and it's a condition where my brain sees numbers and letters sometimes backwards. And nobody knew that when I was in middle school or high school. We didn't know what that was, so people thought I was just a bright guy. And I didn't find that I had this disorder until I actually went to college. Most of my friends growing up were drug addicts. I grew up in a pretty rough crowd. I wasn't a drug addict. I never used drugs. And it fascinated me how they could be using these drugs and their whole personality would change. So when I did get to college, I wanted to study how that happened in people. So that it was a natural course for me to sort of become a scientist and a biologist and study drug addiction. It was something that fascinated me even as a kid.
How did you feel when President Bill Clinton called you on the phone and the Secret Service came to your house to protect you before your testimony?
It's pretty cool stuff, actually. Yeah, you know, I don't know that you're ever prepared to get a phone call from the President of the United States, and you know, I kind of think you might get a phone call from somebody who works for him and says, but he called directly, and that was kind of very personal. President Clinton was the first president in history, and the only president in history, the only one ever to go after the tobacco industry. No other president before him, no other president after him has gone after the tobacco industry. So it was a courageous thing for him to do. It was pretty neat going to the White House and meeting the president, vice president, and sitting with his staff and relaying to him our concerns about people dying. For me, it's been a life-changing experience, but it certainly has been an interesting life. Yeah. Not too many people, you know, are fortunate enough to meet presidents and talk to Congress and talk to young people and try to influence people's lives. And that's what scientists try to do. We try to influence people's lives.
Why did you originally get involved with Philip Morris, and then how did your views of kind of the tobacco industry change as you were working for them?
Good question. It's probably hard for younger folks to imagine, but in 1979, when I first was interviewed, actually it was 1980, that's 34 years ago. Let me paint a picture for you. 34 years ago, you could smoke in this lobby. 34 years ago, you could smoke in restaurants. You could smoke in bars. You could smoke in movie theaters. There wasn't a place on earth you couldn't smoke 34 years ago. And everybody accepted that. Now, I'm a young scientist, and what does a scientist want to do? Scientists want to help people. That's why we become scientists, because we want to help people. And here's a tobacco company, comes up and says, hey, we got a problem. We're killing about 130,000 people a year from heart attacks, and we don't want to do that. And you're a scientist, and you're pretty bright. Can you come help us not kill people? I jumped at that opportunity. Jumped at it. This was an opportunity to make a scientific difference that was going to save people's lives. I went to that company and I bought it. As we'd started to develop the research that started to prove the addiction, as we started to show that the brain was changing in our rats, you know, why do rats give themselves nicotine? You know, I mean, you think about it, rats don't have jobs, rats don't have kids, peer pressure, rats don't lose jobs, rats don't see magazines, they don't have advertisements. The reason rats like nicotine is because their brain gets addicted to it. As we started to develop that theory and that hypothesis, our lab became a liability. Our lab was really saying to the tobacco industry, wait a minute, this isn't free choice. These people aren't doing this of free will. You're giving them a drug that takes away their free will. And that's when our views started to change. In 1982, we tried to publish a paper to tell the scientific community. What scientists do is you do research, and then you publish that research, and then it becomes public. And then the public looks at that and says, I'm going to do it over and make sure it's good, or it's going to help people. And they prevented us from publishing. That's the highest, probably, crime you can commit in science, is not to let people know what you've done.
So what are you currently doing to raise kind of awareness about drug addiction?
I talk to about 300,000 students a year, maybe a little more. Most of them are elementary, middle school, and some high school students. I used to talk to middle school and high school, but I've actually moved away from high school a little bit. Now I'm going down levels to elementary school because we're seeing drug addiction occur at a much earlier age. We're seeing a lot of young elementary, 4th and 5th graders experimenting with electronic cigarettes. Nicotine is a drug. Your brain doesn't know whether nicotine came from a cigarette, a cigar, spit tobacco, or electronic cigarette. All your brain knows is that nicotine is a drug. So how you get nicotine in your body, how you get cocaine in your body, how you get all these drugs in your body makes no difference. I don't care if you eat it, snort it up your nose, inject it in your vein. Once it's in your blood, your brain's going to change. So these are the kinds of messages that young people need to hear. I'm talking about younger than you. You guys know this stuff. I'm talking about we need to go down to elementary school and teach these kids this stuff. Now, some high school students don't know it either. And nobody thinks they're going to become a drug addict. Everybody's going to try it. But as their brain slowly begins to change. You know, the one thing about drug addiction is really important. It's not an event. It's a process. It's a process by which you will change your own brain with a drug. And each drug has a different process. For example, it can take you 12 weeks to get addicted to cocaine. It can take you 6 months for nicotine. It can take you a year for alcohol. But once that process begins, your brain will begin to change. And once you started on that process, unless you stop that process, you will get addicted. Nobody is immune from drug addiction.
Okay, what research did you have to do to support the theory that nicotine changed a person's brain other than the dopamine river analogy?
One of the things that's important in drug addiction is the word tolerance. And this means that a person can use more of the drug as their brain changes. And what we see with people is that people start smoking, they start with usually 1 or 2 cigarettes, maybe a day. And then their brain becomes tolerant, gets used to it. So that was a key component to prove that nicotine caused tolerance in the brain. It's very important that the brain becomes used to the drug being inside it.
Also, I wanted to ask, can you tell us a little bit about dissecting Sarah's brain, and then also the story about the man who's dying of terminal illness, when you just dissect what his brain also proved. And
Sure. Sarah was a capuchin monkey, and she lived in our laboratory for about 20 years, and she was one of our experimental subjects, and she was a drug addict, and she was addicted to nicotine. And when she did die, and she died of natural causes, she died of old age. We took her brain out because, you know, one of the things people say is I quit smoking, but I still want a cigarette. Or I quit using spit tobacco, but I still want to use spit. You know, people who are drug addicts still crave that drug even when the drug isn't in their body. And here was Sarah, who was addicted to nicotine, and there was no drug in her body when she died. So the question was, is her brain still changed? So we kind of went in there and looked at the brain cells, and they were changed. But that doesn't necessarily mean that happens in a person's brain either. So you have to prove it. So we actually found a person who was dying of cancer and who donated his brain. And we examined his brain, and we found the same changes that you see in the rats and the monkeys and his brain. So this was kind of definitive proof that, you know, you can study something in a rat, and that predicts what happens in a primate, and that predicts what happens in people.
So like you said that the monkey died without any like nicotine system, like the brain was still changed, like it wasn't.
Mm-hmm. See, the one thing about drug addiction that's interesting is once you change your brain's going to remain changed for the rest of your life. It's called memory. People remember what it was to be addicted to a drug, and that memory is never going to go away. So that's why we say to somebody, once you're a drug addict the rest of your life. It doesn't mean you're on that drug. It means you're at risk for being on that drug. Let me give you a story. This is a good story. I had a school teacher who broke her tooth and during the summer, and she went to her dentist, and her dentist was on vacation. So the dental people at the office sent her to a new dentist. And she went there, and she was going to have a procedure. But on her chart, she was a former heroin user. 20 years before, when she was young, she was addicted to heroin. And on her chart it said, do not administer morphine. Because you see, the first time she got addicted to morphine, it can take you 2 months. The second time you get addicted to it, it takes you 1 day. So she was given morphine for her pain, and she was re-addicted to heroin in one day. That's why once your brain changes, your brain remembers how to be a drug addict. That's why it's very, very dangerous to go down that path.
When you first started working at Philip Morris, you had to sign a secrecy agreement.
Yes.
When you started your work, how did you get out of that agreement?
When you go to work for a lot of companies, you sign a secrecy agreement. When I work in pharmaceutical companies, you sign a secrecy agreement. And the agreement basically says that, you know, you won't divulge what you've done for a period of time. Most pharmaceutical companies say 5 years, but the tobacco industry, we weren't allowed to divulge for a whole life. So we signed a secrecy agreement that said as long as we're alive, nobody would be able, we could never tell people what we did. How we got out of that agreement was interesting. In January of 1994, the tobacco industry, 7 tobacco industry executives agreed to appear before Congress. They were going to appear on April 14th, 1994. So we let the government know that we were out there. Paul and I called the FBI and said, look, you guys got to get us released from this agreement, because we got stuff we can't tell you. Because if we do tell you now that we're silenced by that agreement, nobody will ever hear it. It'll be put in trial. So they hatched a plan, and the plan was to allow the 7 executives to be on national TV for 3.5 hours, swearing nicotine's not addictive, cigarette smoking doesn't cause cancer. And on national TV, one of the congressmen said, we have a guy named Victor DeNoble who will testify before this committee, but he can't because you have him silenced by a secrecy agreement. We want him released from that agreement. Now you got to figure yourself, you're a tobacco executive, you're on national TV, the entire world is watching you. If they say no, he can't come and testify, then obviously they're covering things up. And that's what they tried to do. They said no for several minutes. And then finally the tobacco lawyers said, look, we got to release this guy. Let's just hope he screws up. So they released us on April 14th, 1994 in a congressional hearing. And then 2 weeks later, the FBI brought us to Congress, and we got to tell Congress the true story about the rats.
I have a question. Could you explain how you and Dr. Amelie stole the documents from Philip Morris and like the documentation and like the processes?
Sure. You guys are young enough, you probably haven't been fired from a job yet. You will be. Everybody gets fired. When people get fired from a job, they usually escort you out of the building. They don't let you back in your office. But Philip Morris they never fired anybody before. So when we got fired, they didn't know what to do with us. So they sent us back to our laboratory. Well, we were back in the laboratory, and they rounded up all the people in the research center and put them in the auditorium. And they were telling those people, you know, you can't talk about Victor and Paul. So nobody was around. The documents were there, and we felt if we took them, we could, you know, help them reveal the story. So we ended up borrowing the documents. Well, borrowing, yes, because eventually they went back. So, you know, had I kept the documents, you could technically say I stole them, but I borrowed them, used them, and then they were sent back by a lawyer. So, but you have to understand, I wrote the documents. They're my research papers, and that's called intellectual property. And when you write something, it's your property. Now, when you work for a company, they have rights to it. But in this instance, I felt we were being fired. Research was being suppressed. The company was lying to the public. I had absolutely no reservations about taking my own work.
How did you feel when, like, your lawyer sold the documents back then? Like, how did you find out this stuff?
Well, we didn't find out until much later on. We didn't find out until after the congressional hearing in '94. So all those years, we thought that the lawyer was broken into and the documents were stolen. It wasn't until the FBI did an investigation and found out that the lawyer sold them back. And you know, at that point, it was 10 years later. I had already testified in Congress. I didn't care. It was done. It was a done deal. So the fact that we got to testify, the fact that we got to tell the truth, and the fact that, you know, we basically proved that these guys were lying to you about addiction, that was enough for us.
What is the master settlement agreement, and what role did your testimony play into that?
Wow. The Master Settlement Agreement was an agreement between the tobacco industry and the individual states. And basically what it said was, the tobacco industry is going to give you a bunch of money as long as you don't sue them. And my role in that was, I was an antagonist. I was not in favor of that agreement. I don't know how you measure a person's life. How much is one person's life worth? So I was opposed to the agreement, and I said so on the White House lawn when I talked to the Vice President and President, and I think the agreement, it's done, it's there, nothing we can do about it, but I think that was a fundamental mistake. For states to partner with the industry and say, we'll let you kill people as long as we can have some of your money. That's wrong.
So what would be something you would be in favor of?
Oh, there's no doubt on my mind. Just abolish the tobacco industry. Why have an industry around that kills 450,000 Americans every year and worldwide kills 6 million people a year? That's crazy. Do away with it.
So you said that you overall, I guess you don't support the MSA, or you don't think it does enough to, I guess, punish the tobacco industry. But do you agree with some of like the advertising rules that it puts on the tobacco industry, where it kind of, I mean, do you think it does have some positive things?
You can go two ways. You can say we should have closed them down. We didn't, so we have the MSA, and you have to live with it. Okay, so you can rant and rave and say it was a bad agreement, but it's there. It does give you some restrictions on an advertising. It gives you some restrictions on flavored cigarettes, and all of these things chip away at the tobacco industry's empire. So yes, it's a positive event. Could it have been a much better event? The answer is absolutely yes. It's like the FDA regulations. Now, tobacco is now regulated by the FDA. Well, they're not regulated by the FDA. Everybody says that. The tobacco industry is regulated by the FDA. That's not true. They are subject to regulation by the FDA. It's very different. Saying you're regulated means there are rules in place that you can't break. They are subject to regulation. So the FDA can propose a rule. They'll make a rule, you can't use menthol in cigarettes. That's a rule. The tobacco industry now has the rights to go to a court and say to a judge, that's a bad rule, judge. A lot of people like menthol, and it will hurt our sales. So just because people are subject to regulation doesn't mean they're regulated. In fact, if the regulations were signed by President Obama, I believe on June 22nd, 2009, might be July, I don't know, 22nd. And since that time, there have been no regulations that have been approved. There have been regulations proposed, but nothing's been approved yet. So it takes a long, long, long time for government regulations to have any impact on an industry.
How do you feel the tobacco industry is finding loopholes in the Master Settlement Agreement?
Oh, beautiful question. There is nothing in the Master Settlement Agreement that is binding. The tobacco industry has the rights, and they shouldn't have them. They have the right to challenge anything in the Master Settlement Agreement in court. Even if they lose, if they challenge it in court, it could take years, 10 years, for that to come to trial. During that time, they can behave as if nothing is regulating them. So it's like having a tiger with no teeth. They can legally challenge any rule, any regulation, except the stuff what they agreed to is the advertising and stuff like that. That stuff is set in stone.
So do you believe that to stop these tobacco industries, it's going to take civic action rather than government action?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think the best way to attack the tobacco industry is to focus on young people. Elementary, middle school kids, using high school students as mentors, as peer educators. Little kids look up to you. They want to be you guys. So using you as mentors and educators. Education is the key, in my opinion. Regulation is the secondary process because regulation takes so long. So I think it's truth and education.
What is your advice to youth?
I'm sorry?
What is your advice to youth?
My advice to youth, gosh, where do I begin? get an education. It doesn't have to be college. Just keep learning your whole life. Pick something new, read about it. Just keep learning your whole life. Find a job, but find a job you're passionate about. Find a job that you may not make all the money you think you should make, but if you're passionate about what you do, if you love what you do, you can't believe how happy you'll be in your life. So don't pick a career based on financial considerations. Pick a career based on, what do I want to do? What's my legacy when I'm 70 years old? And you will get there.